Hello and welcome to CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is your weekly news wrap. I'm Adam Innes, and today we're going to be discussing the new zoning laws in Halifax. Yesterday, the Halifax Regional Council unanimously passed the Housing Accelerator Fund. Big zoning changes will be coming to Halifax soon with this fund's plan passing. We will swiftly see the approval of dozens of development projects, and Halifax will get denser and taller. We may see up to 8 units per lot in many residential areas and in the HRM's core, and buildings of up to 9 stories along key transit routes. We will also see the expansion of multiple heritage areas. The city has developed this strategy to speed up the development of housing in the HRM. This is part of the federal government's Housing Accelerator Fund. The province received $79 million from the federal government as part of this fund. Halifax Council held public hearings earlier this week. Over 80 people spoke, many in favor of these zoning laws, some with concerns or suggested changes, and most speaking out against them. I have with me 2 guests to discuss the different factors of these changes. Peggy Cameron is an environmental consultant here in Halifax, the CEO of an environmental consulting group. Among her accomplishments, she is also the co-founder of the nonprofit community group Friends of the Halifax Commons, a group dedicated to community members in the Commons neighborhood, as well as the protection of green space in the area. Good morning, Peggy.
Good morning.
Great, and you're coming through great. And I also have Joseph Kirby with me, and Joseph is a local housing advocate, outspoken community member. He is the co-founder of More Homes Halifax, a community group dedicated to increasing housing stock and affordable housing in Halifax. The group pushes for policy adoption and reform that would encourage more housing to be built in the HRM. Good morning, Joseph.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great. It's good to be on the air. So I want to start with Peggy. Peggy, you spoke during the public hearings this week.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about what you said to council in regards to the new zoning laws and the Accelerator Fund.
What I said was mainly that there had been a lot of change already taken place under the center plan, and even when the mayor was originally quoting his response initially to the offer of $80 million from the federal government, he mentioned the numbers of building units that could be built. And subsequently, we found out that it was he underestimated a little bit. It was right now 15,179 housing units could be built in Halifax. And as well, there's a space for 250,000 additional units as of right that could be built. And he said at that time, which is true today, that the biggest impediment that's stopping development is high interest rates, labor cost, and I can't remember the third, but anyway, there's other factors than just zoning. And I wasn't impressed that the city chose to just do blanket rezoning and not really address what the minister federally, Sean Fraser, was stressing, which was missing middle and sort of more of a gentle density. And I was pointing out that as well as all of these approved units, there's lots of empty space, particularly publicly owned space that needs to be used for affordable housing. This is not assuring either more housing will be built, and it's certainly ensuring it will not be affordable, and also the demolition of a lot of existing affordable housing. So there's no protection for what we have. And I'm not talking about it from a historic or a heritage perspective. It's just this incentivizes land speculation and demolitions.
And I want to get back to a few of those points, but first I want to ask Joseph, you didn't speak at the hearings, but representatives from More Homes Halifax did speak.
Correct, yes.
Would you tell me about what More Homes' position on the Accelerator Fund is and what some of your representatives were saying at the hearings?
Sure, well, we're fully in support of the zoning changes because you can't solve a housing shortage if you're not allowed to build housing. And so we have to allow people to build housing for those who are demanding housing. And we're seeing rents go up like crazy. A lot of people listening to this, I'm guessing, are students because you're listening to Dow Radio, and you're probably feeling a lot of the pressures from this housing crisis right now. And it's obviously not just zoning. I mean, interest rates do affect it too, but interest rates being high, I mean, that comes and goes, right? Whereas these zoning policies have been around for a very, very long time, these very restrictive zoning policies. And what these zoning policies do, in effect, is the larger developers, they are Peggy mentioned land speculation. It's very easy to speculate and price gauge people into unaffordable situations if you have these large developers who cannot compete with smaller developers who are and small construction businesses trying to build homes for people and stuff like that. Zoning policy facilitates conditions where you essentially encourage monopolies, like land monopolies and homeowner monopolies and stuff like that, where landlords can just price gauge people. So I'm fully in support of all the zoning changes that took place. And it wasn't the only thing that the HAF sought to do as well. Another thing that the city committed to is reducing mandatory parking minimums, which are, Peggy mentioned the environment, are very bad for the environment. Mandatory parking minimums, because what you're doing in effect is you're telling businesses that they have to have a parking space even if there is not a demand for parking, and what you're doing is you're basically putting slabs of concrete that nobody's using. I see so many just empty parking lots that nobody is ever using across the city, across Halifax, across Dartmouth, in a lot of areas. And this is really bad for CO2 emissions. I mean, that could be used for green space. That could be used for housing too. So it also discourages new housing from being constructed. So yeah, I don't really have any issue with everything in the HAF. And a lot of the people who were volunteering with me and people who spoke in favor of it that were not volunteering with me, they pointed out a lot of very important things, mostly giving their own experiences with the housing crisis. Like, there was one young lady who is working full time and she has a good life, but she wants to have kids and she can't afford to have kids. Another person who was there, who's a volunteer with me, his name's Adrian White. He was also saying that he would like to be able to afford to build a family and start a life. And he can't do that because he doesn't have any housing options available to him. Our vacancy rates are like 1%, 0.6%. They fluctuate between somewhere in that range. That's way below what a healthy vacancy rate is. We are crammed into homes. The demand is there, but there's no housing because people are not allowed to build it. And the HAF is making a very, very modest request. It's saying that if you're allowed to build 2 units on a plot of land in a residential neighborhood, you should be allowed to build something that's 4 units. There was nothing about spacing requirements or anything like that in the HAF, so it's still taking up the same amount of space. And I think a lot of these places allow up to 2 or 3 stories. Adding an extra story to that is not going to meaningfully change, even from a neighborhood character perspective, which is what a lot of the people who oppose this had to say. Even from that perspective, it's not changing the character of the neighborhood to a significant degree. And if it is, it's going to be a very slow and incremental process, even if you allow the zoning changes to go through. So yeah, I fully support the zoning changes. I don't see a good argument against them. I think all zoning policy does is just encourages landlord monopolies and rampant speculation, and it just hurts people, and it encourages and it further exacerbates our housing shortage. It makes housing so slow to build. And we shouldn't have to wait until a small minority of the city go into a public hearing and give the council their thoughts and concerns and permission to build housing for a home that they're not going to be occupying, that they're not going to be living in at all. I just see no justification for that.
So we have 2 slightly different perspectives here. It seems like you two do share concerns, several concerns, but Joseph, you were happy to see the HAF pass.
Yes.
Peggy, skeptical. Would you want to respond to some of what Joseph just said there?
Yeah, I would say that, first of all, the existing zoning in Halifax is not from a long time ago. It was approved in 2019, 2020 under the Centre Plan. And certainly some of the elements of HAF might increase density in more traditional single home neighborhoods. But the Centre Plan, I'm not saying either or. I'm just clarifying that the center plan did allow densification of those neighborhoods through backyard suites. And the existing changes to height are really what are concerning, because rather than looking at what small developers could do by changing or creating incentives really for small scale infill developments, the city increased heights along corridors from 6 to 8 stories, to 9 stories, which is effectively 10 stories. And in neighborhoods where there would be 30 stories, it's now 40 stories, and only large-scale developers will do those kinds of developments. I did a study in 2020, and my concern was looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, Joseph makes a very important point about parking requirements, but it also leads to another broader question about what the city needs to be doing to improve infrastructure. And one of the infrastructures that they're really missing out on is modal shift, or getting people out of cars and doing proper transit and active transportation. And that's something I've been advocating since I moved to the city in 2000. But back to the study, what I was doing was trying to figure out what's going on with development and what's the effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And it took me a long time to tease out ideas that other countries are looking at. And Canada's not doing really anything at a national level. There's a little bit happening in Vancouver and in BC. But we're not really establishing carbon budgets for the kinds of buildings that we're building. And it gets into emissions and the impact on climate. And upfront carbon emissions are the emissions related to the energy used to produce the products and materials when we construct a building. I'll get to the point. Sorry, this is kind of, it's a deadly boring topic, and it's hard to get a 10-second soundbite.
I don't think it's boring at all, but
so we're not talking about what is critical, because when we say embodied carbon, everybody thinks, oh, it's in the building and it's safe there. But what it breaks down into two parts. It's the upfront emissions. That's like a giant carbon burp. So as soon as we build a building, we've burped the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and we don't recapture them. So that led me to look at, I hired an engineering firm in Toronto, and we looked at a case study here, and we used a Carlton block where, everybody was very confused about what was going on in the Carlton block. Was it 16 and 22 story tower, or was it 26 and 28 stories? Then it turned out it was 4 towers. It was 16, 26, 24, and 28. And then it turned out by the end of the public hearings, it was 2 40-story towers. But initially we looked at what was the upfront carbon emissions from those buildings, and it is 31,000 tons. And then we modeled a smaller building that could go in the interior where all the parking is. It's exactly what you're saying. It's incentivizing people to drive by having all this available parking. And it's taking up area which could be green space. So it's already kind of a write-off. And we thought there was a young architect who skillfully modeled a 9-story building in there. And then we assessed what was the difference in the carbon emissions per square meter. And it's disproportionately greater. The higher towers were 40% greater per square meter than the lower tower, the 9-story tower. And that's true of all towers. And then another aspect was, and this really plays into what's going on with affordable housing. We don't even have a missing middle. We have a demolished middle. So there's 12 to 14 buildings will be demolished for that redevelopment. They have 110 to 114 small-scale affordable housing units or office spaces in those buildings. And when they're demolished, they'll be gone. My measurements show it's equivalent to a 12-story apartment building being taken out off the market, and it's not replaced. But to replace that floor area in the new building is about 2,000 greenhouse gas emissions. And so really we're doing the carbon, we're giving a double whammy to the climate by not looking at what the best built form is for emissions per square meter. The second, there's many parts to this, but another part of that is that operationally high rises are just not efficient to operate, to heat, light, or cool. And there are arguments that putting all of that carbon out there immediately to build the towers is justified because you reduce transportation. But in my study, the one set of buildings on that block will produce something like, I don't know, it's a huge amount of emissions that is equivalent to, several 100,000 or million cars. So it doesn't weigh off that you have the savings in energy for transportation. And furthermore, to Joseph's point, those developments, as they stand now, will have 700 underground parking spots in them. So it means that people aren't getting out of their cars. So I'm not on the other side of what you're saying. I'm just saying we needed to take more time to do what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. And Peggy, you were a signatory of a petition which raised a lot of the concerns you just mentioned about the plan and asked the city to take more time developing its housing approach. I want to talk more about the environmental concerns you just raised. You mentioned in there carbon budgets and various solutions, but the population of Halifax is growing significantly. We have a very fast-growing downtown core, one of the fastest in the nation. We need, as of now, roughly 20,000 new housing units, and that likely will increase. So few disagree that we need housing. You both agree that we need housing, and we need a lot of it. So, Peggy, what are the, just once more, solutions to ensure that this is done with carbon in mind? What kind of recommendations would you make to ensure that as this development continues, we are, easy on the environment or easier on the environment?
Well, I guess one of the first things is, and this isn't from a heritage perspective, this is just from the point that we need to be wasting less. And so what can we do to modify existing buildings? So I'm completely on with what Joseph is suggesting about raising the roof, raising the building, adding on to the back, all these things. And what happens when you do small scale development is you do enable smaller scale developers to do it. And because, when you build big buildings, generally developers take a lot of time to take different lots, consolidate them, and then they demolish what's there. And then they build these, because they're greenhouse, they're energy intensive buildings. There's a lot of concrete, there's steel, aluminum, glass, and it takes a long time to do the development and then actually physically build it. Those buildings are more costly. They also suck a lot of the labor force out of the community, because if somebody's working on, say, Richmond Yards, they're going to be working there for 2 to 3 years on a project that took, maybe 5. In the case of the Dexel development and the Ruvalis development at Carlton Block, they've been working just to develop those or get them in place for 10 years. And so instead of doing that, you get lots of opportunity for small scale developers to move in, do more projects, which are quicker and much cheaper, and can therefore protect what is there, but also add more housing, which can be affordable. It is a problem that when you build new buildings, they are more costly than what is there. So Halifax is not doing a good job of protecting existing buildings, either because of demolitions, particularly. Like in my study, I looked at what they've done for demolitions, and between 2003 and 2020, Halifax demolished something like 2,600 buildings. And we'd have no idea how many units that was because they were not doing unit counts. And a minimum estimate is that's 17 city blocks of floor area, not just individual houses, but the whole floor area. It's about the same size as what would have been in the Cogswell interchange, just floor area. No, only where people would live. And then I was tracking the demolitions after 2000 with another guy called William Breckenridge, and we kind of gave up last year because it was hard to get the information, and it was hard to. We never did get the unit counts, but last year, the Elizabeth Fry Society confirmed our concerns because they released a report in August, and they said in 8 months last year, in 2023, the city had issued 300 demo evictions, or renovictions. That means people had to move because their apartments were being redone, and then 200 demolition permits. So that's 500 units, or probably more because we don't know the unit counts for the 200 buildings that were demolished. All of those are, again, taken out of the affordable housing market. So the city and the province are not protecting existing units, and they're not really creating new affordable housing. There's examples where the city could have used public land, like Bloomfield, St. Pat's, Alexandra, and they could have said, well, the value of St. Pat's, which we're going to sell, is $32 million. If we take that to the federal government or to the provincial government, and we get them to match the funds, we can say, look, we're offering you $32 million. What can you do with that amount of money? And instead, they just sold it, and it's been sitting empty. In the case of the province, I don't remember the number, but for Eisner's Cove, which was hotly disputed because they just landed it on a marsh, a wetland, which has a huge environmental value, the cost per unit for the affordable buildings, which is only going to be for 20 years. It's basically like giving Shaw Development a down payment. We're going to say, we'll give you this amount of money. That's enough money for you to bankroll your whole development. And it was $59,000 per affordable unit. So if we took that scale of money, we could put it into non-market housing. We could put it into housing co-ops, co-housing. We could be using our public land for land trusts. And there's a whole menu of ways that the city could be protecting what's here, but adding to it in a way that is of benefit to people who need housing. We're not building affordable housing. We're destroying affordable housing.
That's interesting, and I want to go further down that menu soon. Joseph, your response to some of these concerns, and your perspective on, the criticism that affordable housing isn't going to come with the HAF passing, and also that Peggy also mentioned infrastructure not exactly keeping up, transit, things like that. Do you want to respond to what Peggy said and talk a little bit about your perspective on these things?
Sure. Well, I can't respond to everything because there was a lot that was said, but I'll do my best. So first of all, I just want to say, completely agree that climate change is real and that we have to do something about it. Just want to make that position clear.
Glad we all agree
glad
here.
We all agree on that. And what I would say is when it comes to building like high rises, I think you mentioned like 40-story buildings and towers and stuff like that. When it comes to that, I think that we can build these and we can address climate change at the same time. I don't believe that they're mutually exclusive. I think we can encourage people to install heat pumps in their homes and things like that, and drive less and all these different things. And I think that, yes, we should be funding more transit. We should be funding, alternative forms of travel and stuff like that to cars, and building more densely and allowing for people to build more densely will encourage that behavior. And the HAF, I agree, doesn't do it sufficiently, but it does do things that are necessary that do move in that direction more. So they're fair critiques to say that, they could be doing more in this way, there could be more money going towards affordable housing, transferring money to the province so the province can put more into affordable housing instead of just the 200 or so public housing units that they built recently, and that we can open things up more for these. I completely agree that there's always more that you can do. But I would say that wouldn't be a reason to then oppose the little that is being done right now. We need, you cannot build affordable housing if you are not allowed to build affordable housing. I went to a public hearing, I think it was last summer, there was a nonprofit house, there was a nonprofit, I don't remember exactly how many stories it was. I think it was probably about 6 stories. This is a while ago, so forgive me for not remembering everything. But it was something like that. It was like 250 or so units. So that's a lot of housing. And it was done by Dartmouth Housing, the nonprofit Dartmouth Housing, and they were set to be, the rents were going to be at like 40% what the market value is, which is really, really good by affordable housing standards that exist right now. And the opposition to that was 2 landlords went in together, and they said, you can't let us compete with this housing. You have to stop this housing from being constructed, because if you stop this housing from being constructed, our tenants might move to the new housing. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the market you chose to participate in. What did you expect, right? You chose to do that. You can't just go to the government and say, well, you can, but you shouldn't be able to. You can't just go to the government and say, hey, I want to entrap my tenants with me and not give them options to move out of my place because I might lose money. And when it comes to these zoning changes, the more you free up zoning when it comes to housing options and our basic needs, the more you discourage behavior like that. And I think that we can discourage behavior like that by freeing up the zoning policies while also addressing climate change. And it seems like parts of the HAF do things that are trying to address climate change, like the parking minimums that Peggy and I seem to be in agreement on. I agree as well that, of course, because it's not getting rid of all parking minimums, they just said that they have to commit to lowering some, not all of them. There are going to be, mass scale, underground parking lots that, people may not necessarily be demanding at all, that the city is just requiring new developers to build those. And I agree, we should get rid of all parking minimums. I'm not in favor of parking minimums at all in any capacity. I think that if you want parking, then the people can decide if they want parking or not. So yeah, that's to sum it up, my response to Peggy's main points. We can solve climate change and we can build more housing. These are not mutually exclusive. And I also have a question for you, Peggy, if you don't mind. You keep referring to this study. Is this like a peer-reviewed study that you did, or?
No, it's a study that I did, but I hired a national climate change consultancy called Mantle. Okay. And they're engineers, and they are the people who did the research and did the comparison. Cool. And I had very positive international review. And it's largely been ignored by Halifax, the climate change folks at HRM that have a $20 million budget. Mm-hmm. And there's only been 2 councillors who have looked at it. Mm-hmm. And a couple of the councillors were perfectly dismissive and nasty about it. So I think that it's something that's not on our radar sufficiently. Mm-hmm. And I completely agree. It is possible to address climate in our building. That is the point of my study. The taller the building, the more intensive greenhouse gas materials are that are being used just because of structure. Sure. So you have to have more cement, more steel, more glass, more aluminum. Yes. And therefore, if we were to do smaller scale infill or modify existing buildings, we can make different material choices and product choices and different design that actually upfront reduces the carbon, and we can have much more efficient buildings. And, or if we retrofit buildings, it's like Dalhousie has a good example of retrofitting a large building. They retrofitted the Tupper building. Yes. And instead, what we would do in this city, if we were developers, we would well, not right now because it's more costly, but there's been examples of large buildings that have been demolished that ought to have been repurposed. So I think, I don't know whether it's a trauma or it's a colonial model, but we like to just have empty land and start afresh. And I think there's many ways that we could be accommodating our climate needs. Once those emissions are out there, we don't get them back.
So here's what I would ask.
Okay.
So,
Hold on, Joseph, just before you respond,
Sure.
Peggy, would you mind telling listeners where they could find the study that you're referencing?
Sure. It's called Buildings for the Climate Crisis, and it's a Halifax case study, and you can find it on Friends of Halifax Common website. And it's available. There was a bit of media attention at the time, and what I am a big proponent of, and that's what I said at the city yesterday, is I was very careful to not to try and not polarize discussion, which I feel is what happens as a result of public hearings.
Oh yeah,
it gets misrepresented in the media. How many were for, how many were against. What age they were they old people or were they young people? And I feel like what we ought to be doing, what we could be doing is coming together and putting our energy into something that's productive. And so what I did in my study was to show all of the ways that we could have what we're trying to do, which is missing middle, gentle density, affordable housing. And I'm really interested in what our society needs, not what our developer needs. And I feel like the HAF is another way of giving the big boys more territory. It's like the next stage in the monopoly game.
I completely disagree with that.
Okay, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, so if you free up more zoning, that means that the smaller developers who are trying to build more can build more, and they can compete with the larger developers. Now, it is true that the larger developers will also be operating within that same market, but if you block off the smaller developers' opportunities to build more housing, then you're just allowing the larger developers to continue to monopolize, like was mentioned before. And I would also ask you this.
Well, just on that point, if we were really truly only interested in the smaller developers, we would not have been increasing heights at 7 stories to 10 stories.
No.
Or 30 stories to 40 stories. We would have been, the amendments that the city asked for in the center plan were ones that the planners chose to put together. So the city could have done anything to amend the center plan to completely favor small scale developers.
No. When I say small developers, I mean that they're smaller in business size. I don't mean that they're smaller in the types of homes that they want to build. When I'm when it comes to increasing the amount of height that is allowed to be built, that's for the people who are demanding the housing be built there. And it's not just for the developers. And what I would ask you is, what's the alternative to that? Because if we're not allowed to build tall buildings, that demand for the additional stories is still going to be there from the people trying to find a place to live. So what happens as an alternative, this is usually what happens in practice, is that demand is now being side pushed into some other part, usually going into wetlands and usually going into forests and stuff like that, which leads to more deforestation. Sprawl, that's what sprawl does. Sprawl is bad for the environment. And so that seems to be the alternative.
In Halifax, that's not the case. We're not Paris, we're not London, we're not Toronto. We have acres of empty land, even on the peninsula, brownfields, like where we have vacant land. So, example, and I've been saying it for years, why aren't we redeveloping car dealerships, shopping malls? The Cogswell is happening, but it's happening at a very slow pace. And then there's lots of, in fact, HRM did a study in 2019 at the center plan. I wrapped up my comments by offering 3 suggestions that could be amended to the center plan to ensure that we were keeping housing affordable or that we were incentivizing the right kind of development. And one was in Vancouver and in Toronto, if an existing unit is torn down, that for a redevelopment, that unit has to be accounted for in the new building at the same rent. And that happens in Vancouver and in Toronto. A second thing was in Montreal, they have a requirement that in every new development, I'm not sure of what, maybe over 6 units, there has to be 20% affordable, 20% social, and 20% family housing. So that means, 2 or 3 bedrooms. Those are requirements that the cities put on to the developers. And the third thing that happened in Montreal, and I don't know about other cities, but I know I can talk about what Vienna does, is in Montreal in the 90s, they put in a tax on vacant land. And it was because they saw that they had too much vacant land in the downtown and they wanted to incentivize development. And so finally, this past year, I think in about February, the staff came out with a report. They didn't look at regulating demolitions, which would really protect existing affordable housing. What they did was they said, well, let's consider doing a vacant lot tax. And they finally tabulated how many vacant lots there were in Halifax in HRM. Now, it's a huge area. So in the total of HRM, there's 12,000 vacant lots that, first of all, they could tax. And secondly, if they taxed it sufficiently, that would incentivize the development or the sale of that land so somebody would do something with it. And I can talk about Vienna in a minute, but I don't want to, right. I want you to have a chance to talk about
No, of course, with that, we are talking about a kind of sprawl.
In what way?
In the sense that it's we're not densifying the currently developed areas, we're building on undeveloped land.
No, actually, we're building on land that's empty. So I think in the urban core, it's something like 2,600 vacant lots. So that land, instead of sitting as a parking lot or as a car dealer shop, or just somebody's waiting on it because they're going to make money on it when they flip it in the future, or they're looking to build an aggregate of lots so they can build a bigger land. That land is actually costing us all. It's probably costing us from an environmental perspective if it's, hard surfaced and it's just for storing private cars.
If it's a parking lot.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
That's
or if it's a car dealership or if it's a shopping mall, and it also is, it's counter to what we are trying to do. I mean, not just do we need to reduce parking, and we need to really, really prioritize and support transit and active transportation. So all of the ways that the city could be sending the right signals, they're still not doing it. And I would just say on reducing the minimum parking requirements, that's a huge cost saving to developers. If you had to put in the Carlton block, it's going to be 6 levels of underground parking. And so by not pouring all that concrete, doing all that excavation, they're making a huge amount of savings. Is that savings going to be passed on to their tenants? It's like Killam was just noted last week for making, a huge profit last year. And a lot of it, they said, was because of energy savings, that they had reduced their utility costs in a time when our utility costs are going up. They're very smart business operators. They're putting in solar panels. They are using heat pumps. They're reducing their energy costs. But we also know that their rents went up as well. So another way that we're not really looking at what is the benefit of reducing parking restrictions is it's a complete money in the pocket for the developers.
Rents went up so high because of the current zoning regimen.
Would you explain what you mean by that, Joseph?
Well, because if they can't compete with anybody, then they can easily just keep raking in record profits by continuing to raise their rent. They're allowed to do that. They don't have any incentive not to. But if you allow other people to compete with them, then they're disincentivized from doing so. This is kind of what I was getting at the beginning of this when I was saying that the zoning changes are going to discourage that kind of price gauging and that kind of monopolization, is because, it goes back to the example I gave when the 2 landlords went up and they just said the quiet part out loud back at that affordable housing hearing for what Dartmouth Housing was doing. I'm trying to, you said a lot of stuff, so I'm trying to just find something to respond to.
Well, Well, we can discuss.
Oh, wait a second. No, I remember now what I wanted to say. I remember what I wanted to say now. So,
first of all, I'd just like to say I don't think we're on completely different sides of the issue. So don't feel like you have to respond in a way that is dismissing what I'm saying. Try and hear what I'm saying.
No, I'm hearing what you're saying.
You mentioned earlier that you can't contain neither of you can contain your perspective into a soundbite. I don't want sound bites here at CKDU News Wrap. I want an in-depth discussion. And that's why we're all here. So that being said, Joseph, if you want to continue.
Yeah, so I was about to completely agree with some of the things you said, actually. So I completely agree that if there's empty land, if somebody just bought a piece of land, they're not doing anything with it, it's just sitting there and accruing in value, that we should do something about that, and even that we should have a tax system which discourages that. There's this very old idea from a guy named Henry George. It's called a land value tax. Now, he believed in it in a very different way than I do, but basically what they do in Australia is instead of taxing property value, what they do is they tax land value instead, which is worth more than property value, so it generates more revenue, and it discourages that kind of, sitting on land and not using it for anything, and it encourages more development, and it encourages infill development, which is better for the environment. So yeah, her and I are completely aligned on that front. And now, one thing that I will say, just some gentle pushback, is a lot of empty lots. There are empty lots that are like that, but a lot of them are also just people waiting for council to approve of the developments that they actually want to do there, right?
Now we've seen with HAF passing, many of these will be approved quite swiftly. Yeah. So a lot of those were vacant lots as well. So that's another thing to factor in when we're looking at vacant lots. You are correct that there are a lot of greedy people who are just trying to take advantage of soaring land value, because it's land, right? There's no production that goes into maintaining land. So you can just buy land and let it sit there and have it accrue in value and just take advantage of the space and not do anything with it. So yeah, I completely support a tax regimen that would discourage that. We just have to also bear in mind that a lot of these people are also waiting for developments to be okayed by council, and you want to make sure that the tax is targeted in a way so it's not going at those people, because that could just completely discourage the development altogether, the infill development. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that.
I would just say that, first of all, I wouldn't characterize developers as greedy people. I think they're business operators and they're doing something which is motivated for profit. They're not motivated for keeping people able to have housing necessarily. I mean, they might say they are, but they're not interested in either preserving existing affordability. They do have to have a certain ability to have people who are their service people. Like, they want to have cleaners and maintenance people. They do get to the problem where they're understanding there's a worker issue. But it's a very different mindset than thinking from a nonprofit perspective, where you do have the idea of who's going to get to build there, or who's going to get to build there and who's going to get to live there. And I don't think the city is really thinking about who's doing the building, who gets to live there. I think they're just using a market solution. And I wouldn't know that a lot of the 26,000 lots are waiting for approval. I don't know that. I don't know that the city looked into that. But I would just go back to what I said initially, and that is that there already are 15,000 units approved. So those are fully permitted. And what's stopping them from going forward is the current situation of where there's not enough labor, not enough the interest is expensive, and so developers have the capacity to sit and not do anything with that land. Back to the idea of taxing, I completely support your idea of having tax, and that's why I proposed it in 2019. And that's a model that Vienna's known for having affordable housing, but it's also known for just having housing. I'm not sure of the number, but it's a large percentage. It could be 40, 50, 60% of people live in some kind of state-owned housing or city-owned housing. And it came I think it was, again, a person who had this idea that we could have a policy that would make land not have a high value from a speculative perspective, like not to make money on, but the land would have a value for what we would do, what we would build on it. And so just after the First World War, around that time, they taxed land, and it was 1.5% or 2%. They created a fund, and then they started to tax, maybe you know more about it, but they started to tax very valuable residential property. And they took the 1.5% from or 2% from the value of the tax on the land, and they added the 1.5% or the 2% on the value of the expensive, exclusive residential property, and they put that together and they got a fund. And that fund is like a community trust, and that's how. And somebody probably knows more about this than I do, and I could be getting it, but it's the concept to take that fund and use that fund to build housing on public land that meets the need of a society. So Halifax is not doing that when they're just doing, I would say, blanket rezoning, because they didn't talk to people about what is the impact of that zoning or what would be a better solution. If you want to say something about that, but I wanted to talk about what the effect of blanket zoning is.
Well, first thing I'd like to say is that, I completely agree that there should be more investments in affordable housing and more use of public land in order to build more affordable housing, public housing, and, non-market housing and all of these things. But blanket rezoning complements that. It's not in opposition to that. When you free up zoning policy, you're providing people with more opportunities to still build in the market as it exists. And you need to provide those opportunities for as long as the government is not building that. So we can do both. They're not mutually exclusive.
Except for that, I think when I'm going to say my point about what's wrong with blanket rezoning.
Go for it.
And that was
and would you also just briefly define blanket rezoning?
It means where they just say, well, okay, anywhere. Well, they just did it with HAF. They said they did it anywhere where there's a corridor. I think it was 6 stories. It's actually 7 stories because if you add a penthouse, that doesn't count. So now it can be 9 stories, but it's actually 10 stories. And that's along corridors. And an interesting thing about corridors is, I've been thinking this for a long time, and then there's this architectural critic for the Globe and Mail, Alex somebody. I mostly disagree with what he says, but he said something very interesting. He said the reason corridors exist is it's because it's where people, developers can acquire land, because people who are there are a little bit disenfranchised already, like they don't own the buildings, so they want to redevelop it. So that's actually what happened in Halifax during the center plan consultations. Initially, there was a map with yellow spots, which showed where there was going to be targeted growth areas. And then over time, it started off with Andy Fillmore, and over time it came back. And I called it the blue blob corridor map, because what happened was there were all these yellow blobs, and then they got extended into blue blobs, so it got to be longer and longer. We weren't talking about corridors initially. We were talking about targeted growth areas. So those were the ideas of we'll put a lot of people here and we'll have, I guess it would be a complete community. And then as it morphed into corridors, which I think in Canada started in Vancouver, you could see that developers were acquiring land all along those areas to redevelop it, and that it was actually the rezoning was complementing what the developers wanted. So it's very much like what Joseph's describing. What happened in the area where I live, north of the Common, is I was paying attention to corridors, and my concern was all of the buildings that were there, which are missing middle. There's multiple units. Most of the buildings on Robie Street, there were very few that were single family. A lot of them had, many as 8 units in this. So it's the missing middle, gentle density, affordable. People lived there for a long time, and it was good, good mixture of student housing, whatever. A lot of that, as soon as it got rezoned, got bought and demolished. And last year, just to show what happens with blanket rezoning. One thing is the buildings get speculated on. And then the value of the land is inflated because you can build something larger on it. The value of the land, to your matter of the land tax, becomes greater than the value of the building. So there's a developer, he's not a developer, he's more like a demolisher in town, Steve Temecles. He acquired about 32 buildings, a lot of it on Roby Street, but throughout the peninsula. And he tore them all down. And then he sold a portion of the empty lots. He didn't sell them all, but say 25. I don't know. It was an all Nova Scotia story, and they didn't say how many he sold. They said a portion. He sold those for $62 million. So immediately, just by demolishing buildings, he inflated the value of that land. And that means anything that gets built on it will have a greater cost. Moving further north.
That's half true, I think. So it is true that land value does go up the more that you build on the land. It increases the land value, but there is a difference between land value and structural value. So that's basically what property value is evaluated by. It's sort of like the mean between land value and the value of the structure that's on the land. You're right that the land value goes up, but if you're building more housing, if it's set up in an optimal way where you can actually provide more housing to more people and more developers can compete with other developers and stuff like that, and there's less of a monopoly than what would otherwise be the case, the structural value isn't, at the very, very least, the most charitable I can be to your position, is that the rents will not go up nearly as fast as they otherwise would if you keep the zoning as is. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say to that. That's all. You can continue.
No, but why is that?
Because you're allowing more people to provide for the housing shortage. Right?
Well, there's two things that are a problem. One is there's nothing gone on those lands to replace it. The land value is going up to be greater now than what it was with buildings where people lived. Mm-hmm. The buildings that were there had affordable housing in it. All of those people have just been displaced.
Right. Okay.
And anything that is new will be more costly than what is there. And it's only going to happen when the interest rates, the labor force, and the market demand meets what the developer wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Sure, I understand. Sorry, I misunderstood what you were saying. So, I agree then that through the application process for when they build that, you could have requirements saying if you want to redevelop here, that's fine. Just make sure that there are affordable housing targets. So we're not increasing rent beyond what those people were paying before. I completely agree with that. I just don't think that justifies. Sorry, I hit the mic by mistake. I just don't think that justifies keeping the zoning as is and not rezoning it for that, because the application process isn't just the public consultation that goes if you want to build somewhere and have it rezoned. The application process is so much more than that too. It's also about making sure that things are to code, making sure that you're building the place safely. So, OHS will come and inspect it. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into the application process. So I think that the city can just negotiate that amongst them. I don't see a reason why there has to be a public consultation process where we have a small minority of the city come in who for the most part don't live in these places. Usually it's people who are already housed going to the public hearings and doing that. And it seems like all the zoning
actually,
changes
just to interrupt you on that point, I think there's a misunderstanding. Under the center plan, there is no public hearing. That's all as of right.
I'm not
Everything is approved. The 15,000 units that could be built now are all approved. The 250,000 units that could be built now are all approved. There is no contention. They will go forward.
No, I agree.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to jump in here because we're running out of time.
Okay.
And
no
you're both very knowledgeable, and there's a lot of information going around. And we've been, we've found mutual ground on taxing vacant lots. We found mutual ground on a few issues. We're both concerned. You're both concerned about affordable housing. You're both concerned about sustainably developing this city and ensuring that infrastructure keeps up. It seems to me that, Joseph, you are very happy with HAF passing, and you believe that a lot of these things will keep up or should keep up. Peggy, it seems that you wanted more time to be taken with HAF before, as you called it, blanket rezoning, just passed. So now that HAF has passed, both of you, this is an individual question. Joseph, what does Better Homes Halifax do now? Where does your advocacy pivot? And Peggy, where does your advocacy pivot? I want to start with Peggy.
First of all, I think that the big miss on HAF is that there will be no future negotiation required for ensuring affordability in new buildings. There's nothing in that document which responds to the crisis the city is in of having affordable housing. Building more housing is not an affordable housing solution. It's good to have more housing, but if we're also inflating the value of the land, inflating the value of the rents as we displace existing affordable housing, and giving all of that to any scale developer, we're not looking at what society needs. So I think that there really is an important need for the city to be taking strong steps to ensuring that most of their focus is on building non-market affordable housing. In my neighborhood, because of the city's blanket corridor rezoning under the center plan, it wasn't under HAF, it was done without public consultation. I live in an area where there's many kinds of housing, multi-unit, and directly because they want to widen Robie Street.
Yeah.
There's First Nations housing, 8 non-market housing co-ops, and 3 shelters that are all directly or indirectly impacted by the idea of widening
and
Robie Street.
Some businesses as well, too, in that area.
Yeah, exactly. They've been lost already. And under a FOIPOP, I was able to get information about what it looks like, the survey. And with the help of someone else, we located the trees that will be cut. And between Kennard and North Street, the city intends to cut 90 trees. So back to one of my issues about what we're doing in the city is we're not doing enough, and the city needs to be looking at this under half of how are we protecting existing green space and existing trees. Mm-hmm. And these trees, because of climate change, what's going on with, intense heat, intense rain, high pollution, most trees and many more vectors of disease, many trees will not thrive or grow even if we plant them, and we're planting them in harsher and harsher circumstance. So it's very disappointing that the city itself, it's not the hospital, it's not a developer, it's the city would contemplate and plan to cut 80 trees. So I think we really need to be taking a bigger view of how do we reduce our impact on carbon emissions, and how do we really have a city that is responding to climate emergency and affordable emergency.
Okay. And Joseph, where does More Homes Halifax pivot its advocacy now that HAF has passed?
Well, it's not really pivoting that much. Mm-hmm. We want more housing options to be legalized, both affordable, non-market, and market housing. We believe that we're in a housing shortage, and we need to continue to just push for more parking minimums to be reduced so we can deal with climate change, to legalize more infill housing so we can deal with climate change. But of course, at the end of the day, what it's ultimately about is having more affordable housing options for people, more people who can actually find a place to live and are not being price gauged by their landlords into oblivion because they benefit from the regulatory capture that they get from these zoning policies. So we're just going to push for that more, because even though the HAF moves in that direction, it doesn't do it sufficiently. Because legalizing 4 units and 4 stories across the HRM that's much better than what exists, but it's not sufficient to deal with the crisis. It's going to help, but it's not sufficient. So we're mostly just going to be pushing for more, and that's where our advocacy. It doesn't really pivot, I guess. It's just and since
just refocus. I guess not pivot.
Well, yeah, we're just gonna keep focusing on that aspect of it, and just extend an olive branch, Peggy. I know that I had some disagreements with you, and I'm very passionate about this topic. This topic is my number one issue right now when it comes to basically anything. It's on my mind all the time. Just know it's ideas. It's not people. I have nothing against you as a person at all. If I disagree with you, I don't think you got that impression, but just in case you did, I just like to say, it's ideas, and I enjoy talking to you a lot. So yeah, and I'm glad that, and we do agree on quite a fair bit. when it comes to the climate and things like that. We just disagree on, the whether or not zoning will be effective and these sorts of things. So.
And how this was handled and how HAF was handled and how quickly it was handled.
Actually, that's a point that I would make. I think that that's what I said yesterday, is these kinds of discussions are the kind of conversations that should have gone on leading into HAF.
Yes.
And instead, what we had the sitting planning staff recreate a plan that was from 2019 that already permitted 250,000 units as of right, and 15,000 units are fully permitted. And they didn't take that model and use it to what the federal government suggested we could do, which is to have more affordable housing. That $80 million is not going to affordable housing. It's going mostly to hiring planning staff to change plans that we spent a decade putting in up and approved in 2019 and 2020. So wouldn't it have been good if they could have had conversations with Joseph or with me and talked about how could we actually achieve the goal that we want and assure that there is affordable housing? If we're giving away height, we're giving away profit, why aren't we ensuring that a portion of that goes to keeping people housed?
Well, hold on. I have to cut us off. Unfortunately, our hour is done. But you guys are great, and we should have you on again, and maybe get a third mic or a fourth mic next time. But just quickly, for those listening at home, the Housing Accelerator Fund passed unanimously at Council yesterday after lengthy public consultation. Or after lengthy public hearings. Consultation is debatable, but heritage and character dominated a lot of the discussion, and we will be seeing changes to this city now with these zoning laws. We will see taller buildings, we will see denser areas.
Yes.
And Joseph is happy about that. Many people are not. But this is where we stand now. In this conversation, we've gone to Montreal, Vienna, Australia. We've discussed many different things, but listeners at home, think about Halifax in the next 10 years, and enjoy your Friday, everyone. This was the News Wrap on CKDU 88.1 FM.